Hi there, this is Carl Irwin again. I'm bored and I have some time in my hands to do these videos. I'm not going to do many more of them because I'm going to be traveling for vacation and I won't really be paying that much attention to drum corps probably later on in the summer. But as I've been doing a few of these over the last week, there's been a lot of back and forth on the forum and even on the videos in the discussion area in the comment section about some of the propositions I make. First, I want to say that I'm not saying anything that's absurd. I'm not saying anything that's kind of outlandish or out of the ordinary. I'm actually trying to speak some simple logic to some of the questions that people have among drum corps fandom, which is a complete waste of time. I understand, but here we are. So, yeah, for those of you that care about this stuff and are enjoying these videos, here's a little bit more. If you don't, you can click off and go somewhere else. So I have here a bunch of different lineups. These are finals lineups through the past couple of decades. And I just want to make a few comparisons. First of all, on placement and names of drum corps, but most importantly, on where they're at, what their positions are. Because a lot of the discussion has been about scoring and slotting. Again, it's the premise that a drum corps, when slotted into a particular area, into a tier, as we say, they cannot move because they are put into that position and they're lined up in that position in competition. Therefore, the comparisons are unfair. Those are the claims that have been made, and some people are really persisting in this. One of the things I want to demonstrate here is, perhaps there was a time when the contending drum corps were extremely reliable, meaning that you'd have a tier of drum corps and it was always the same drum corps for 10 plus years, right? And that's not quite the case anymore. Now, what jades this picture a little bit is one name, and that is Blue Devils. Okay, so you think of Blue Devils, and the Blue Devils have always been at the top, but they're kind of the only ones that have always been at the top. There's been a lot of other drum corps move in and out, and if you were to name the lineup this year of the top contending drum corps, and you were to relate that to the 1990s, other than the Blue Devils, everybody would be scratching their heads if you introduced them to that. They'd say, oh my goodness, wow. Things must have improved. Everything must have gotten better for this to happen. Well, the fact is there was never really anything wrong. It's a very simple equation that I've been touting here all along, and that is that a program has to make some very specific decisions in the off season, and it might take more than 1 year to do this. Often it does. But they have to make very targeted decisions to be competitive. And that has to do with recruitment, and it has to do with staffing, and most importantly, it has to do with design. They have to design a program that is competitive. And when I say design, I'm not actually referring to the more subjective elements like GE, general effect sort of kinds of design issues. The design really has to hinge on content and achievement. You have to have content that is hard, and you have to have a talent base that can achieve it. And if you have those two things, you move up like a rocket. You just move up very, very quickly. Those are the main issues. And I'm going to make a few claims here right off the top concerning one discussion I've had going on in the forums at DCP. Because again, I'm bored, about Phantom Regiment. So DCI has a ranking out there right now, which we talked about in the last video, where Phantom Regiment is ranked third. Because I'm not sure that's even still the case, because there's been some shows since then. They were ranked third out of the lineup, and it's just completely astonishing because they're clearly not third, because their head-to-head a lineup with other drum corps has not put them at third. They've been below that. Well, I explained that in the last video. It's an average of scores over 3 shows. Some drum corps are not performing as much. That's part of their calculation, right? The blue coats are not doing a lot of shows. They're calculating. I guarantee it. I don't have inside information, but I guarantee they're calculating kind of like the Blue Devils have, to perform a little less and spend more time on tweaking that program and making major adjustments and major alterations in order to keep it competitive. Alterations having to do with content and achievement, and a little bit of buffing out with some of the smoothness of the flow and general effect and whatnot. So you have Phantom Regiment here ranked in 3rd when they don't deserve it. Well, here's something I want to claim. Phantom Regiment has the talent to contend. They actually have the achievement element pretty well locked in. I am stating that Phantom Regiment could perform any one of these other contending shows. They just have that kind of a group. They may not be the only ones that have that kind of group. I wouldn't say the Cavaliers have that kind of group because they seem to be suffering on their achievement. But the Phantom Regiment certainly does. They're amazing. They sound great. Their soloists are phenomenal. They're the best out there right now in this season. They just need the content that would match the talent level, and they would do it. And one thing I'm positing out there is that they perhaps could make some adjustments that would close up the gap a lot more than people realize. So am I saying that they're in 3rd, or that they'll end up in 3rd, or that they'll end up higher, or 4th, or even closer? No, I'm not making any hard claims at all. I'm just looking at reality, and my point is that they actually have it. They actually do have the elements in place in terms of their talent base. And they suffer in minor ways on the content. They have most of what is required. They have most of what is required to contend. They're just a little shy on some of the writing. And that's pretty much the situation for Phantom Regiment. So that's the only point I've been making on the forum. So as people are saying, they're not in 3rd and everybody knows it, I'm saying, wait a minute. You're not objectively looking at the group. They may not be in 3rd and everybody knows it because of some head-to-head comparison that we have already seen. But this average of shows, in spite of the absurd inflation of numbers, the average of shows actually points to something that is real. And that is that they are extremely talented and they have most of what is required to actually kind of push into that area that the ranking is suggesting. That's all I'm saying. And don't be surprised if they do. And don't be surprised if they do that I come back to the forums and say, I told you so, right? Because I can see what's going on here. Enough of that. I want to do some comparison. And then I'll talk a little bit about my time in drum corps when I was there, a very short time that I actually did this thing, and some observations I made in real time with the situation I was in with my associates in the Blue Coats at that time. So 1990. I'm looking way back 1990. Here's what the lineup was at finals from 1st to 12th. Cadets, Cavaliers, Star of Indiana, Blue Devils, Phantom Regiment, Santa Clara Vanguard, Crossmen, Blue Coats, Madison Scouts, Velvet Knights, Spirit of Atlanta, Dutch Boy. Right? Some names you haven't heard in a long time. Some names that we know are around, but they weren't, they're not in that tier right now. Curiously, Blue Coats in 8th place. They spent an awful long time in 8th place. There was a time here about 10 years later where they fell way out and they didn't even make finals. But they've always had a pretty strong program at Blue Coats. Crossman was a perennial kind of middle packer. Santa Clara Vanguard was kind of down low there for 1990, having just won a championship before that. And Phantom Regiment down. There was actually a tie that year. Blue Devils and Phantom Regiment tied for 4th. So technically, Blue Devils not medaling, but also potentially 5th place. 95.3, these are pretty high scores. Santa Clara Vanguard at 6th place with a 94, and next one was an 89 for the Crossmen. Cadets were 97.7, that was a winning year for them. Blue Devils was a really great show that year, particularly musically. I just want to point out the Blue Devils have not always medaled. Now, I understand this was a long time ago, but even as recently as the mid-2000s, they didn't medal, from what I recall. And this is not about them not having, this is not about the Blue Devils having an off year. You completely misunderstand how this works. If you think that the Blue Devils scoring lower than first or second means that they had an off year, you're ignorant. You are completely ignorant. Them scoring low is actually an indication of something else. It's an indication of a bunch of other organizations doing as well as them. That's what it actually means. Okay, that's what it actually means. The Blue Devils have never been bad. They're not going to be bad. I mean, unless something serious happens in the organization, they have good people and they have good design, and I say good design, and some of you are cringing at that because you look at it and you say it's just a bunch of what I call pretentious nonsense, and it often is. I grant you that. That's how I feel too. But when you look at the content and the achievement, which is the bulk of the numbers, that's most of it. Most of it is objective. How hard is the music? How well are you playing it? They play extremely hard music and they play it extremely well. And when you look at times when they're low in the lineup, it's because other drum corps are playing extremely hard music and they're playing it extremely well. That's the difference. So if you're thinking right now that the Blue Devils this year can't be in fourth place, why not? Of course they can. Of course they can. They certainly can be in fourth place. It's highly likely they could be in fourth place this year because you have the Boston Crusaders are playing extremely hard music extremely well. And same for the visual. Take this to the visual too. They're doing very complicated drill and they're doing it very well. It's very clean. Carolina Crown is playing very hard music with very good visual and they're doing extremely well, both of them. The Bluecoats are doing extremely hard music. They're playing extremely well. They've got a very good visual. And the Blue Devils, as always, have very hard music and, they're playing extremely well. And I want to include in there Phantom Regiment has some pretty hard music. They don't feature, I think, enough moments to warrant that content achievement area or an achievement of content. But they're certainly playing what they're doing very well, and they do have time. They have time to write in a few things that could flip the script for them. So, and they're not the only ones. I mean, there's a few others in there. The Mandarins are really great. There's a few other drum corps in there that you should be paying close attention to. So, can the Blue Devils place lower than 1? Yeah, it's totally anytime. They could do it at any time because they don't control everything. They only control what they do, and they are reliably very, very good. And when you get other groups that are reliably, or not even reliably, just in a moment, in a snapshot, in a year, are very good, things are going to change. It's the way it is, okay? So anyway, that's 1990, just for a picture. And I'll just point out the big ones. I'm going to ignore Star of Indiana because shortly after this they were irrelevant. They had gone into a different thing. Eventually they became Blast, a Broadway production. That's where the organization went. But you had Cadets, Cavaliers, Blue Devils, Phantom Regiment is in there, and Santa Clara Vanguard is the other one I want to point out. So these are really the biggies. Santa Clara Vanguard, Cavaliers, Blue Devils, Cadets. Those are the big four. They held on to that for the entirety of the decade, really. There's a couple moments where some of them slip out a little bit, but those are the ones when you're talking about slotting and moving into tiers, these are the groups that everyone was saying, well, they're just the golden groups and no one can compete with them because of slotting. They're not lined up with them. The slotting keeps them from getting into that area. And the reality of it, what I'm saying is that they were playing extremely hard music, extremely well. Their visuals were complex. They were doing extremely well. That is why they were the golden ones, and others weren't coming close to that. And it really didn't matter where they came in the lineup. Every one of these drum corps could have gone first on any night, and they still would have achieved what they did. That's my claim. Okay, and I'll get to that in a minute when I get to the end of this talk. Quick snapshot, middle of the decade, 1997. Running down finals, Blue Devils were 1, Cadets, Santa Clara Vanguard, Phantom Regiment, Madison Scouts, Crossmen, Cavaliers were 7th. Right after that, they were 7th place. They went quite low that year, if you remember. I want to say that might have been the Stravinsky year that they did. A Rite of Spring, I think, just didn't work out for them. Glassmen, another name, haven't heard in a long time. Blue Knights, we know that name. Magic of Orlando, a defunct drum corps. Blue Coats there in 11th. Carolina Crown peeking into the bottom. And Carolina Crown started becoming a perennial finalist in the low tier, kind of with Blue Coats and those other ones too. 2000. Blue Coats previous to 2000, they weren't in it. They didn't make finals in 1999. That was a big deal. And that led to some significant changes in the offseason. And I was around for that. And I'll talk about that a little bit here in a moment. Lineup 1 to 12. Cadets Cavaliers tied for first. You remember that? They were playing on, Cadets were playing on B-flat instruments. This was the first year there was B-flat. Cadets and Blue Devils had B-flat instruments. Cavaliers had G instruments, and I was there for that, and I saw that, and you couldn't tell the difference. And the next year when there was a split, G and B-flat, you couldn't tell the difference. That's a whole nother discussion for some other time. Those people that think that there's some major difference between the B-flat and G, you're insane. I was there. You can't tell. Brass is brass. When you have a big chorale of brass instruments covering high frequencies to low frequencies, it really doesn't matter what key they're in. I'm just saying. Okay, so Cadets Cavaliers first place, 97.65. I thought I was going to die as a fan in the stands that night, way in the top of the stadium, and the chants of no more ties. It felt like a riot was going to break out. That was very interesting that night. Blue Devils, third place, 96. Santa Clara Vanguard, 94. Fourth place, Boston Crusaders, fifth place. This blows up slotting entirely. This whole thing with Boston Crusaders that year. They just came out with something and they got credit immediately for it. This is what I'm saying. They made decisions in the off season to be competitive, and they went to fifth place like that. And any drum corps can do that. All you got to do is play hard music really well, have a complex, compelling visual, and march it really well. That's it. You do that stuff, it really doesn't matter what the design of the show is. I mean, it can't be completely bizarre and incoherent. It has to have some kind of coherence for the judges to award some favor or have some explanation. It can be very esoteric, but that's not the bulk of the issue. Hard music, hard drill, march it well, play it well. You do that stuff and you shoot like a rocket up to the top. Okay? Boston Crusaders, the slotting business is just untrue. It's just not true. The issue is that organizations don't make those kinds of decisions like that. They don't make really, really serious commitments to doing hard stuff and doing it well and recruiting people to do it well. That doesn't happen that quickly, and most of them don't make concerted efforts to do it. That's the issue, and it can get crowded. So even when you do start making those decisions, if others are making those decisions too, well, it's hard to get out of that because you don't control everything, right? Blue Knights, sixth place. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. Phantom Regiment, seventh. Glassmen, eighth. Crossmen, Madison Scouts, Carolina Crown. Blue Coats got back into finals, 12th place. Okay. 2001, I marched this year. Okay, this was when I was in the Blue Coats. It was 2001. The lineup that year: Cavaliers first, Cadets second, Blue Devils third. Again, third place. Fourth place, Santa Clara Vanguard. Glassmen, fifth place. Phantom Regiment, sixth place. Crossmen, seventh place. Blue Coats, eighth place. Bumped up to eighth place. Boston Crusaders went down to ninth. Carolina Crown, Madison Scouts, and Colts. So what happened with the Blue Coats that year? They decided to make those decisions. They made decisions the previous year to get serious and get back into finals, and they did it. They were serious, and they did squeak it in. And by 2001, they were making other decisions. They're saying, look, this design needs to be better. It needs to be more competitive. This is not about just entertaining the crowd. It's about entertaining the crowd with the right motivations. And it paid off for us in that time. And we bumped up to eighth. And our competitive tier at that time was, and I remember this vividly, was Phantom Regiment, Crossmen, us, Boston Crusaders. Those were the people we were competing with. Okay, so there was a four-way run that year. Could never quite grab Phantom Regiment. I think we grabbed the Crossmen a couple times. We beat the Phantom Regiment in a number of different captions that year. We're very competitive in brass that year. I remember at one of the regionals we placed fifth in brass. So we were just underneath. There was all of the B flat instruments, and then there was us. And I remember one of the technicians that year got a T-shirt made right after that regional that said "Best Brass in G." Right, blue coats. It's kind of a fun little gag. So the brass program was really improving at that time. The visual was suffering. It was not a very high content load. It wasn't a very difficult show to march. That was an issue for us. It kept us where we were at. We had to have harder visuals. The music, although we were playing pretty well, we had a really solid brass horn line. The music was not nearly as difficult as what the Glassmen were doing. The Glassmen were kind of isolated in fifth place. They were not competing against anybody. They didn't have anybody fighting with them, and they weren't fighting with anybody else. There was a margin on both sides, and that's how it happened. Sometimes you have a tier where you're by yourself. Sometimes that tier where you're by yourself is in the first slot. And we've seen, the Blue Devils do that before, where they have one undefeated season, and it's like a whole point between them and everybody else, and nobody ever really beats them or competes with them, and they kind of hold the line on all the captions. Anybody can do that, though. That can happen with anybody at any time. It doesn't just have to be them. They just have to decide to do it. Anyway, that's what was going on at that time. But what I want to point out here is somebody's missing. Cavaliers, Cadets, Blue Devils, Santa Clara Vanguard, Glassmen, Phantom Regiment, Crossmen, Bluecoats, Boston Crusaders, Carolina Crown, Madison Scouts, Colts. Let me go back to 2000. Cadets, Cavaliers, Blue Devils, Santa Clara Vanguard, Boston Crusaders, Blue Knights. 2001 was not good for the Blue Knights, okay? And I remember this as a fan of drum corps. And you got to remember this. People that march in drum corps are fans. I was trying to make this point earlier about the lineup. Why certain drum corps that achieve very high are later in the lineup. The reason why they're later in the lineup usually is not because of slotting. It's because they have high caliber content. They play hard stuff and march hard shows, and they do it extremely well. And that in and of itself is the bulk of the entertainment value. I remember the 1990s when the Madison Scouts, it was a big thing, mid-90s especially, when the Madison Scouts were very middle of the pack, sometimes even low. And everyone was griping and complaining about, why aren't the Madison Scouts winning it all? They're just so amazing and they're so entertaining, and all this Spanish music they're playing, and they're just peeling paint with it. It's so loud and it's so aggressive, and it's just the Madison Scouts as we know them. And when push came to shove, you would ask someone back at that time, well, who would they beat? Who would you put the Madison Scouts over? And no one could ever bring themselves to say that they were better than the Cadets, or that they were better than the Blue Devils, or they were better than Santa Clara Vanguard, or that they were better than the Cavaliers at that time. No one would ever say that. What the real gripe was when people are making this complaint about entertaining shows, all they're really saying, but they don't know how to say it, is they're saying, I wish that the contending shows were like the Madison Scouts. That's really what they're saying. That's what's really going on the inside and here and in here. But they're not saying it the right way. When they say, I wish the Madison Scouts were winning, what they really mean is, I wish the Blue Devils were as entertaining as the Madison Scouts. And that is completely fair, but you have to understand this is an issue of aesthetics. It's not an issue of content and achievement. And content and achievement is most of what the value is. But I also say that the content and achievement is most of what the entertainment value is. Because the truth of the matter is even at that time, with the Madison Scouts doing what they did best at that time, some of you remember that, you were around for that, you were fans at that time. The truth of the matter is that the loudest screaming always happened at finals night when the second place drum corps was announced. Because that told everyone who won. And people were happy with that. They were pleased with that because hard music played well is most of it. It still is, even to this day. That's why those groups that play hard music and play it well, they go on later because that is the most of the entertainment value. You just can't get around it. Even if the show is extremely esoteric and a real snoozer, People know what good music looks like, and they know what it's, they know when it's played well. I do want to point out too that sports operate on this. I mentioned this in one of the previous 2 videos. Why are we so surprised by that? That's what sporting venues are like, right? Very sporting idioms. What is it about? Doing something hard and doing it well. It's not about the aesthetic choices, right? How does it make me feel? That's not what it's about. And most of drum corps scoring is about that, and most of drum corps fandom is about that, and most of the appeal and entertainment is still about hard music, played well, complex drill, marched well, dazzling visuals, done well. That's what it's about, okay? So here's my story. We knew who the middle tier corps were from the previous year. So on the early shows, we would come back into the stadium if there was a lot of time left to see who was on. And at that time, you were often, because you have to schedule people into the show at specific times because they have to plan on their arrival and their departure and where they're headed and how many hours they got to be on the road, and all this stuff matters. So you kind of set up where people are at in the night based on, yes, on the previous year's scores for the most part, but that's not everything, as I'm going to point to in a moment. But there is that sort of expectation. So the Blue Nights were going on later in the evening. We'd get back into the stadium and sit there, and we'd watch. Sometimes you'd be able to change it if there wasn't a retreat, as they used to do in those days. We'd be able to get into our plain clothes and get back in the stadium and go watch some of these other performances. And yes, as a fan, as someone in the Blue Coats, but as a fan of drum corps, I wanted to see the Cadets, and I wanted to see the Cavaliers, and I wanted to see the Blue Devils. I was a fan of those groups because they played hard music, they did it well, and they had complex. Everybody feels that way about it, right? Even the people in the drum corps, they know that that's the truth. Those of you that are fans and have never marched, I don't want to say that we have better insight, but I just want to explain to you that the insight of people that march is of a higher maturity because of that experience, okay? It just, and I want for you to kind of adopt that mentality because you'll enjoy it more. I think you'll enjoy drum corps more if you just understand how performers feel about it, okay? We get back in the stadium. We wanted to see the Crossmen. We wanted to see the Phantom Regiment. We wanted to see, the Glassmen, what they were doing. We wanted to see, and the Glassmen that year, their show made no sense whatsoever to us. It was totally esoteric, but they were playing hard stuff. They were playing it well, and we kind of understood it, right? But we get in to see the Blue Knights, and I remember vividly sitting there. Blue Knights come on. They do their show, and I literally turned to the person sitting next to me who was in the corps with me, and I said, I don't think we have to worry about them. It was so obvious that their content achievement was tanked. It wasn't written at a high level, and it wasn't being performed very well, and I don't know why and what happened, but they had a hard year. And you know what? It showed up immediately. It's not like they got placed in the spot and they were hard to beat. They were placed in the spot and they were achieving much lower because the judges knew it. There was no slotting keeping them in place and making them hard to get, rub up next to. There's no such thing as slotting in its conspiracy. It just doesn't exist. Now, I understand that if you're a contending drum corps in any tier, you kind of want to go on last because you want to be compared. Now, the one thing I want to point out, though, is that the way judging works today is that, as someone pointed out in one of the previous videos, and this is something I neglected to mention, is that in competition suite, digitally, today, the judges actually can reflect on previous scores and they can adjust them based on how they view the ranking. And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. It means that nobody's locked into something and they can't make mistakes. So that means that, yes, the Blue Devils can go on first of the night and it ain't going to change a thing about their lineup. Same with, Carolina Crown or, it doesn't matter who it is and where they go. It really can be quite random because the ability to reflect is there, and it preserves I think the true status of their content and their achievement. Okay, but sure, you want to go on last. There's something to be said for that. It's favorable. If you're in a debate, we just saw a presidential debate. Okay, we just saw a presidential debate. You want to win that coin flip that allows you to go last. You want to give the final statement at the very end. You want to be the one to do that. The reasons are obvious. How much does it matter? I don't think it matters that much, but it is something people desire. Okay, it's good to go on later, but that doesn't mean there's a conspiracy of slotting. All right, so that's my point. Blue Knights. They didn't have it, and they didn't get credit, and they went down. And, Blue Coats, we were in 12th the previous year, and we jumped up, by the end to 8th, and we were actually pulling even better than that earlier in the season. We kind of sank back down, rested back down underneath the Crossman from where we were pulling earlier on in the season. 2010, jump a decade. Lineup 1 through 12, Blue Devils, Cavaliers, Blue Coats. 10-year separation. Now they're meddling. Okay, again, because hard music played well. That's really the big deal. You got to do that. Okay, Carolina Crown. Someone else was making the same decisions. Okay, you have another drum corps that was making decisions to play harder music and play it well. And I'll tell you what, Carolina Crown has consistently played extremely hard music and played it extremely well, and they get the brass numbers for it. Also, percussion lines were improving at this time, particularly for the Blue Coats, compared to one big thing we suffered from in 2001 is that the writing in percussion was low. It wasn't extremely competitive. They were playing very well. They were really great guys, but they needed a change at that time in personnel, and they got it with Rarick. I mean, eventually they got the right guy to do the right stuff. And Thrower started writing music that was at a caliber. I remember being in there in 2001 and saying, well, we kind of know where we're at, and we know that we can't really improve. And I know that they're beating up on us about, our toes being high enough and, our facings being clean and all this stuff. But the fact is that we really couldn't polish what we had much more than we already had it. We just needed harder stuff. We needed harder stuff and the chance to play it. And when you're in the middle of the season, you can't change it. This brings me to a major point. The change happens between seasons. It doesn't happen in the season. You can't take someone who's in a lower tier of competition and move them all the way up because they do a bunch of rewrites. That is not pragmatic and possible. You dance with the one what brung you. You got to play the show you have, and you can't really meddle with it in such a way that's going to make you jump. You just don't have the opportunity to do that, to do it and do it well and do it clean. Can Phantom Regiment do that? I think they're in a unique situation where they could write in a few licks and they could do some things that might change their music scores. They could do some things visually too that might change their score. You got to be kind of in the right position and have the right kind of talent to be able to do something. But we're not going to be able to do that in the middle of the season. We knew it. We knew our music wasn't hard enough. We could play harder music, but they couldn't just give us harder music and have that work out. That would have had a negative impact on our scoring going forward to just do that. We were better off cleaning what we had and taking what we earned, and then the next year you do something a little bit more difficult. That's how it's done. Or something a lot more difficult if you think you can achieve it. Okay, so 2010, major shakeup by then. Slotting is bunk. It just isn't true. It's not true. It's not true. You make decisions to get you higher. Play harder music, play it well. March harder shows, march them well, right? 2019, because I can't go, 2020 was out, so the closest decade jump we have is 2019. 1 through 12. Blue Devils, Blue Coats, Santa Clara Vanguard, Carolina Crown, Cavaliers, Boston Crusaders. Back up in 6, Blue Knights, Blue Stars, making decisions, right, about their future. Cadets, 9th, Cadets, right? Mandarins, 10th. Crossman, 11th. Phantom Regiment, 12th. Okay, you can see that this slotting thing, it just doesn't compute. Again, 2010 to 2019, again, that lineup. Blue Devils first, Cavaliers, Blue Coats, Carolina Crown, Cadets, Phantom Regiment, Santa Clara Vanguard, Blue Stars, Boston Crusaders, Madison Scouts, Blue Knights, Classmen. I want to say, don't the Cadets win the next year, 2011? They go from 5th to 1st. slotting my elbow. What are you talking about? This slotting stuff, right? It's year to year. It's not within a year. You just don't have a chance. You're going to get scored by what you bring to the table, and you just have to clean what that is, and that's going to put you into place. Okay. 2023, I'm going to go to last year's just very quickly. We had COVID in there. You had an off year where things were not competitive, and then you had a real year, and then you had 2023. Lineup in 2023, as you should recall from last year, 1 through 12. Blue Devils, Blue Coats, Carolina Crown, Boston Crusaders, 4th place Boston Crusaders, 5th place Cadets, and they were 2nd place, right, the year before, 22. Boston was way up there. If I find that right, I think that's right. The Cadets, Mandarins, Phantom Regiment, Cavaliers, Colts, Troopers, Blue Stars again, Blue Knights back in it. You can see that things are shaking up pretty regularly, even as you go back decades, last 30 years or so. I just don't understand this thing about slotting. Now, I want to talk about shows for a moment. There's a show coming up, Broken Arrow, where you're going to get everybody together very soon. This show is going to be happening within the next week or so, right? And we have, what is the date for that show? July 16th, okay? So here's the lineup. Gates open, 6:30, okay? National Anthem, Zephyrus, Drum and Bugle Corps, and then you have, here's the ones we're looking at. The lineup from beginning of the show to the end of the show. Cavaliers, Phantom Regiment, Boston Crusaders, Mandarins, Intermission, Blue Devils, Blue Coats, Carolina Crown. What on earth are you talking about? The lineup needs to be random. That's a random lineup. That is a random lineup. And some of the lineups we've had even up till now have been pretty random, where you have had drum corps that go on earlier that score higher later. I don't understand this complaining. I don't get it. I mean, it's just not, you're not talking reality. And what's going to happen here? This lineup's going to happen. Cavaliers, Phantom Regiment, Boston Crusaders, Mandarins, Blue Devils, Blue Coats, Carolina Crown. I can tell you one thing, the Boston Crusaders are going to be way higher than their lineup. I promise you that. The Blue Devils are likely going to be higher than their lineup, but I don't know. Carolina Crown is not slotted first, but they're going on last. The only one in there, the only group that I see in there that's kind of slotted is the Blue Coats going second to last. They're the only slotted group in the whole shebang. Everybody else is pretty random. Now, granted, corps, groups that are doing harder stuff at a higher achievement are concentrated more on the end than on the beginning, right? With the exception of Boston Crusaders. That's the only thing I give you, but we've already talked about why that is the way it is. There's a reason why, the lineups look that way. So, anyway, that's my discussion on this. I call shenanigans on the slotting thing. I don't see it. I know too much about what is required to do well, and I've seen too many groups do it too frequently over a long period of time. What does it take for the Mandarins to be in first place next year? They have to have a group that can play a show that is extremely difficult, and they have to do it well. And I say play, I mean play and march. And whatever. I mean, let's say, what do they have to do to contend? What do they have to do to contend? Because contending is good enough. I'm a blue coat. My blue coats haven't won DCI championships since 2016. Do I care? Not one bit. Because they contend every single year. That's all I care about. That's all I care about. I don't care if they win it all. I care that they contend. I care that they go out and they put a product on the field that is worthy of the top spot, even if they don't achieve it. That's the healthy view of competition, especially in something like this, which has some subjectivity to it. If I'm in Carolina Crown, I would be quite happy with what they've had over the years since they last won a long time ago, okay, over a decade ago. because they always put out a show that contends. That's the goal, right? It's not about who gets the win. You know, I mean, it is for fans. I understand that, but slotting is not about that. The gripe of slotting is about who can approach contending in a bracket, in a tier. That's what slotting's about. And then whenever you talk about the facts, people who complain about slotting always, every single time, they pivot and they say, yes, but the numbers are within hundredths of a point and tenths of a point. And then I say, aha, but that's not the complaint of slotting. Right now, you're talking about contending in a place, and if they are within that, then it's really anybody's ball game. Anybody can win at that point. If it's within hundredths of a point, two things you shouldn't be surprised about. Whenever it's within tenths or hundredths of a point, you shouldn't be surprised if people change places, and you shouldn't be surprised if they don't, because they're doing the same thing, right? You shouldn't complain one way or the other. It's just it's largely a crapshoot, or the judges are saying, yeah, they're both contending, but it's consistent enough that it's not going to change. They're just going to keep getting these scores the way they are. That's fair. I mean, it doesn't, and largely it doesn't really matter when they go on. You're just going to maintain those same numbers. Historically, that's the way it's been. So anyway, those are my observations. I say this with great enthusiasm, as if I care. I really don't care. I'm bored, so I'm talking about this here right now. I haven't really been paying that close attention to drum corps for the last few years anyway. And as I said, I've got some time on my hands here to do it. And this is probably one of the last videos we'll get. I don't know that I have much more to say about these topics, but just experiencing what it's like to move up from within a drum corps and understanding and hearing from the staff those decisions. Like if you look at 2001 Bluecoats, how many people were on staff there that were on staff when they won? A lot of people, right? The brass group was pretty much the same. I don't remember if Kevin Stahl was in there in 2016, but he was certainly there. I think he was around in 2019. I think he was caption head. He was there in 2001. Some of the writers, certainly the percussion staff changed a little bit. You had some new writers. But I think Tom Rarick was associated earlier, at those other levels. They just started writing stuff that they had, and they had a talent base that could play it and march it. That's all that's required. Write a show that wins, have a group that can do it, and you get credit every time. Nobody will be artificially held down for doing those things. It never pans out that way historically. You can always test the slotting gripe. Name right now a drum corps that is in a lower tier that you think deserves to be higher. And name who should they be beating right now based on what they are doing on the field. And if you can't find yourself having some kind of major margin jump, then slotting, as you know it, does not exist. It doesn't exist. Things truly are fair and random. Okay? Anyway, best of luck computing some of this stuff and enjoy your season.